résistance.
Quels sont les ressorts de la résistance?
Le sens profond de la résistance. Pourquoi finalement, au nom de quelles valeurs je me mobilise?
Résister contre qui et pourquoi?
Résister contre toute forme de régime totalitaire ou très autoritaire.
À se battre pour nos droits et nos libertés, parce que dans beaucoup de pays, justement, tout ça c'est un peu mis à mal.
For promoting democracy, I was threatened to be in jail for 20 years.
I am activist against execution because I don't want anyone has this experience which I have.
Le rôle de la jeunesse est très important dans cette paix et je m'en vais vous dire que nous jeunes, nous sommes prêts.
Cette lutte des Ukrainiens concerne nous tous parce qu'ils se battent pour la démocratie, ils se battent pour la paix, ils se battent pour la liberté.
Et c'est pour cela que ces jeunes puissent être inspirés de ce qui peut se faire de mieux en matière de gouvernance publique, de respect des droits, de respect des libertés, et que ces jeunes puissent devenir les vecteurs de la démocratie de demain. Vive la Normandie, vive la démocratie et vive la liberté.
Good evening. I am not Guy Sorman. He's not here. My name is Soli Özel. I come from Turkey. I'm a lecturer in international relations at a private university. And I've come here now to moderate, but I will also talk. To finish the third episode, if you will, of this program, the first two episodes of which were the concept of the Global South, which, of course, is the new addition to our narrative in international relations. The second one was a few days ago, Is War the New Normal? If you look around the world, I suppose you will say it is. And then ours is the impossible task of arguing whether or not war can be avoided. It is my privilege to share with you that this program was made possible by the Région Normandie in France and their Normandie pour la Paix program. Our first speaker is waiting for us online. Just bear with me for 2 minutes. I want to have a few introductory words. And although it's Vive la démocratie, one place where democracy does not exist is on a panel table. The moderator's worst instincts emerge. I was given a responsibility. I have to live up to it. Okay. Truly, our task is not that easy. Can war be avoidable? Obviously, there's war all around. At least two of them give us nightmares, the one in Ukraine and in Gaza. And that made us kind of forget other calamities that are happening around the world as well. And under those circumstances, however war will be avoided, I'm as anxious to listen to our speakers as you are. But I'll give you some data. Era of insecurity is resetting the global defense industrial landscape. This is from the annual report on its 65th anniversary now of the International Institute for Security Studies based in London. The US and Europe are ramping up production of missiles and ammunition, and while progress has been slow, those efforts promise to soon deliver a greater defense production capacity after decades of underinvestment. And that is something that most peaceful people are now cheering up, because somehow, obviously, Europe will have to be able to defend itself as well. Russia's focus on equipping its armed forces is causing some long-term buyers of arms from Moscow to look elsewhere. Non-US NATO countries are now spending a combined 32% more than they did when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, showing how Moscow's actions have driven a response in the West. While the West ramps up spending, so are China and Russia, which now dedicates more than 30% of government outlays to total military expenditure. The past year has also shown how some armed forces are reviving interest in equipment that had been neglected, such as artillery and air defense, while also embracing new technology, such as hypersonic glide vehicles and cruise missiles or direct attack munitions. And nuclear weapons seem to be once more rather fashionable. And then, with your permission, a little passage on war from Margaret Macmillan, who has actually written a book on war and also on peace. Her book on the Paris peace treaties of 1918-19 were obviously a classic. She does start with a quote by Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarus Nobel Prize winner in literature, who once said that war remains, as it always has been, one of the chief human mysteries. So, Margaret Macmillan writes the following: "There are many paradoxes about war. We fear war, but we are also fascinated by it. We may feel horror at the cruelty of war and its waste, but we can also admire the courage of the soldier and feel the dangerous power of war's glamour. Some of us even admire it as one of the noblest of human activities. War gives its participants license to kill fellow human beings, yet it also requires great altruism. After all, what can be more selfless than being willing to give up your life for another? We have a long tradition of seeing war as a tonic for societies, as bracing them up and bringing out their nobler sides. Before 1914, the German poet Stefan George dismissed his peaceful European world as, quote, the cowardly years of trash and triviality, end quote. And Filippo Marinetti, founder of the futurist movement and future fascist, proclaimed, quote, war is the sole hygiene of the world. Mao Zedong later said something very similar. Revolutionary war is an antitoxin which not only eliminates the enemy's poison, but also purges us of our own filth. But we have another, equally long tradition of seeing war as an evil, productive of nothing but misery, and a sign perhaps that we as a species are irredeemably flawed and doomed to play out our fate in violence to the end of history. And she ends, Svetlana Alexievich is right, war is a mystery and a terrifying one. That is why we must keep trying to understand it. And our first speaker is definitely very well placed to help us understand war and ways to peace. Sandeep Vaslekar is a thought leader on the global future. He has worked with 65 countries under the auspices of the Strategic Foresight Group, an international think tank he founded in 2002. He's the author of A World Without War, published in 2022 by HarperCollins India, and published in French as Entre, guerre, et Paix by CNRS Edition, 2023. He's also the author of, please forgive my pronunciation, Eka Disheka Shod, I'm sure I tortured your title, a best-selling book in his native Marathi language with 25 editions. He's a practitioner of Track 2 diplomacy since the 1990s and has mediated in conflicts in South Asia, those between Western and Islamic countries, on deconstructing terror, transboundary water conflicts, and nuclear risk reduction between permanent members of the UN Security Council. He was invited to address the UN Security Council Session 7818 on water, peace, and security. He's been quoted in more than 3,000 media articles from 80 countries. Weslekar read philosophy, politics, economics at Oxford University from 81 to 83. He was conferred D.Litt of Symbiosis International University by the President of India in 2001. The screen is yours, and you have this wonderful space of time, which is limited to 6 minutes.
Hello, good evening in New York. It's quite early here in Mumbai, but it's a pleasure to join you all. When this seminar was announced, the website of the La Maison, française of New York University quoted Raymond Aron, the famous French political scientist. And Aron always said that the risk of war was at the very core of international relations. If there were no wars, there would be no international relation. There would be a universal state. But Aron was also fond of quoting Clausewitz. And Clausewitz said that war is in the realm of chance. Once there is a war, you never know where it will go. Now, currently, we live in an era of war without winners. If you look at the present war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, or the risk of war between China and the United States in the future, all these wars are not going to end up with any winners at all. These are all lose-lose wars. So what is difference in the wars that are taking place now and the wars which have been waged over the period of last 3,000 to 4,000 years? In the past, somebody won the war, somebody lost, but the humanity survived. In the current wars, first of all, particularly in this century, all parties are losing, and there is a risk that one of these wars, whether the one in Ukraine or one between China and the US or some other potential war, could slide into a global catastrophic war with nuclear weapons. And if that happens, then the survival of human civilization will be at risk. So we are really very close to the point where the human extinction itself is survived, is threatened. We have 2,800 nuclear warheads on hair trigger alert. Increasingly, we are giving control in military matters to algorithms through lethal autonomous weapons, hypersonic missiles, and other technology. And artificial intelligence, rather than military commanders, might decide the fate of humanity. Raymond Aron, again, I'll quote him, and he was writing in 1961 when the Cold War had already begun and the nuclear arms race had begun. And he said that diplomacy is about defending national interest. That is true. But preventing a global hyperbolic war, hyperbolic was his word, is as evident an objective of diplomacy around the world as defending national interest. So he was equating the defense of national interest with the prevention of a global hyperbolic war. And that maxim remains valid today. The top priority of the world today has to be to prevent a global catastrophic war. And since, as Clausewitz said, war is in the realm of chance, you don't know, even a conventional war like the one in Ukraine might perhaps slide into a global catastrophic war. So that is what we have to prevent. Now, where do we go to create a world without war? The United Nations Security Council is paralyzed, but not only that, the UN does not have a robust mechanism for resolution of conflicts, especially when there is a conflict between its 5 permanent members or between big powers. Earlier, whenever there was a conflict between relatively smaller countries or smaller powers, the UN could intervene, and UN has intervened over the last 75 years in many of the regional conflicts. Even the great powers could intervene, and they could try to resolve the conflict or prevent it by persuading the two warring parties. But if the great powers themselves are the parties, then there is no resolution. There is no conflict resolution mechanism in the UN or outside the UN. So if we have to move ahead and create a world of hope where big conflicts could be resolved, first of all, we need some kind of enlightenment that we hope some of the leaders of big countries might acquire from somewhere. When the Cold War was at its peak in 1961, President Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev of the then Soviet Union worked jointly to move a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly, the resolution 1722, which was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly at that time, which called for a total demilitarization, dismantling of military expenditure, military infrastructure, and discontinuance of military expenditure, and the abolition of all weapons of mass destruction, including the nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. So this is what was jointly proposed by the President of the United States and the leader of the Soviet Union, and accepted by all member nations of the United Nations. So we already have a resolution 1722 on the record of the UN General Assembly. We have to revive it at some stage. And who would take the initiative to revive it? You never know. It might still be leaders of one of the P5 countries who might take the initiative. It's possible. Maybe not today, but tomorrow. But there has to be in the political market, especially in the democratic political market, a pressure from the public opinion. In the 1970s and 80s, there was a very active peace movement, an anti-war movement, anti-nuclear movement in United States, in Europe, and even to some extent in the Soviet Union, especially in Kazakhstan, where the testing was taking place. So we need the media and others to mobilize the public opinion all over the world, but particularly in the big countries. Recently, when the movie Oppenheimer was released, it tried to give a message that we are now in a cycle where the destruction of the world was likely. But it didn't somehow move the emotions of the people, and we don't really have anti-war movement. So we need an anti-war movement. Third, we need an initiative by leaders of the global South to mobilize the leaders of United States, Russia, China, and the other countries to try to negotiate solutions to wars. The Africa Peace Initiative, led by the South African president and involving 7 African leaders, they are currently trying to do precisely that in the context of the Ukraine war. Turkey has tried to do it, and Turkey had a limited success when it negotiated a grain deal between the Ukraine and Russia. So, in conclusion, I would say that we need an anti-war movement. We need movement of the leaders of Global South, and finally, we need some enlightenment from the leaders of the great powers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is also online with us, Chandran Nair. I'll keep your bio short so that for the sake of time. After serving for over a decade as Chairman of Environmental Resources Management in Asia Pacific, Mr. Nair founded the Global Institute for Tomorrow, GIFT, to help organizations navigate complexities and adapt to future changes through leadership development and advisory on sustainability, policy, and global shifts. He is a member of various leading international organizations, such as the World Economic Forum, and he is a well-sought-after lecturer in the world's most important business schools. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be invited to say a few words here. I think I'll just make a few comments to set the scene, and since I don't have a serious job like all the other distinguished panel members, I'll say what I think and perhaps annoy a few people. The first thing I'd like to say is watching that video that was just played reminded me of how, at some level, so much of these serious discussions are then paraphrased in ways that allows us to, hark back to some utopian idea that Europeans think about. And then to capture images of young people talking about democracy, etc., and the youth movement, as though there is some utopian view that the Europeans have, which are not exhibited and have not been exhibited for decades, yet throwing this around as though the rest of the world needs to be able to embrace these things. The shameful behavior of the USA and the European nations with regard to the plausible genocide that's taking place in Gaza, I think has ripped the mask off, this facade. And I dare say that most of the world will agree with what I'm saying on this. Clearly, if your audience is simply a Western audience, then we can keep it all polite and simple and decide to have a polite conversation. But I would see that this audience is a global audience, and I think it's very important where these things are kind of convened in the US, etc., for people like me to perhaps come and shed a spotlight on the hypocrisy of what wars are about. I also think it's very important to understand that even in the framing of this discussion, it was very clear to me, who comes from a nation that's never been to war because we're too small and puny, but to also see how intrinsic it is in the nature of conversations in the West to have an enemy. Even in the framings there's just now, it was Russia and China bad, and we in the West are good. We are fighting the good cause. But history will tell us it's the West that has been persistently violent for the last 500 years against communities all over the world. It was European colonization that in fact is unraveling even today in the in the independent area, that is creating lots of tensions. And dare I say that the settler communities that were spawned out of European expansion, which includes, of course, the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., continue to form a cabal in terms of demonizing everybody else that doesn't agree with their thoughts about what is democracy and what is and what isn't. In the rest of the world, and I refrain from using that word global south because I think it's a construct of the Western mindset, and I won't go into why I reject that sort of even framing. But for the global majority, the people who were formerly colonized and oppressed, this framing is all wrong. And the recent, particularly the last 2 decades, the invasion and the war crimes committed in the Middle East, in Iraq, etc., the desire to unsettle Syria, Libya, the crimes in Afghanistan, and now the support for genocide in Gaza has ripped the mask off the Western liberal idea that the West is for peace and not war. So I think what I like to suggest actually is that the Western world needs to come to terms with that it's actually the main perpetrator of war all over the world. This is not to say that every single conflict in the world is a result of Western interference. But no serious study of history of the last 300-400 years can ignore the fact that the West has been the perpetrator of persistent violence across the world. And since the decolonization period, many parts of the developing world are essentially trying to reorganize. I agree with Sandeep that bad leadership in many of these areas have not allowed resolution of post-colonial era restructuring, etc. But you can't run away from the fact that the United States, in my view, has been the perpetrator, and I come from Southeast Asia, and I know what happened in Vietnam. You can't run away from the fact that the United States has been a persistent violator of peace around the world. And so I would suggest that if we are to essentially talk about peace, we need to understand what the constructive peace is. And as Sandeep said, there is no peace movement. In the United States and its allies, there's a military-industrial complex. It's not some imaginary, fictitious thing that I have coined. And in fact, I think it was former US President Eisenhower coined it, and it's essentially captured the state today. It's the largest, it's part of the political economy of the United States. And I think it was a month ago or something like that, that the Financial Times even suggested was lauding the fact that defense spending was increasing. But this is not defense spending, this is war spending. And I will argue that until and unless the Europeans decouple from the United States and allow it to carry on its own and weaken it in its foreign policy by not venturing to support in all its effort to demonize every other country in the world, we will not have peace. And so if we are to have peace, I agree with everything Sandeep said, but we now need to understand what's the catalyst for violence today around the world. And the most powerful catalyst for violence around the world today is the United States of America, its industrial military complex, which includes and has captured even its media. One only needs to see whenever there's a threat of war, how the mainstream media in the United States and the West generally, even the BBC, will all support intervention and war. So my final statement is to Western audiences, you need to be aware that the rest of the world is not on your side. We have understood what has gone on. We who have endured centuries of plunder and colonization, we who are not perfect, who have imperfections, our own little squabbles, etc. But what we have seen is the persistent interference of the West in our affairs, leading to wars. Some of that is being fought out today as we deconstruct the colonial sort of drawing of borders, etc. But the largest regional conflicts in the world for the last 100 years, from World War I to World War II to Vietnam War, etc., Vietnam Wars, etc., and the terrible interventions in the Middle East have been led by the West, and particularly the United States. And until we understand that, and we start to not pay homage to this mirage that is this defense spending, but it's a war industry that needs to be fed, we will not understand how to find peace. And there are many things that can be done to the UN to restructure it. Who's not in favor of it? Typically the United States and its Western allies. And the proof of the pudding is in the disgraceful position it has taken in the genocide that's being committed by Israel in the Middle East. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. About the UN Security Council, I have not heard really that China and Russia were in favor of changing its rules and mechanisms, but maybe Mr. Ambassador will respond to that later on. Judith Miller. Oh, you've been a long time, of course, correspondent in the New York Times. You continue to write, and you're in the Manhattan Institute. And welcome. I'm just keeping it short.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you also to the Maison française for assembling this panel and inviting all of us to speak here and to offer our personal opinions. Mine do not reflect the Manhattan Institute, the former New York Times that I worked for, or any other publication that I write for. That's full disclosure. I'm afraid I'm going to be the pessimist on the panel, and not because I blame the United States for the problems of the world. I do not. In fact, I think that the United States has tried very hard, and especially in this most recent conflict, to stop the slaughter in the Middle East, the region I have covered since 1972. And I just want to go over a few of the wars that I have covered to explain why I'm such a pessimist about the prospect of stopping war and the prospect of making peace. We are all familiar with what happened on October 7th in Israel, which triggered the recent slaughter now in the Middle East, in which 1,200, mostly civilians, were killed, many more wounded, or 240 captured. The result has been an extraordinary but not surprising response from Israel. The death toll now stands at 28,000, but those are Gaza Hamas figures, which must be taken with a grain of salt. We don't know how many people have died, and we don't know how many children have died in that war. But that is only one of a series of conflicts that I have covered. There is, of course, Iran's, through its proxies, assault on its neighbors and alleged friends. There's the Yemen civil war, in which basically 150,000 people were killed, have been killed so far. That war continues on. 227,000 more from famine and from hunger. I don't see anyone protesting in the streets of our cities or anywhere in the world, by the way, or the UN doing much about that. Then I moved to another country I covered a lot, Sudan. The death toll there is so far 15,000 with 35,000 wounded. Let's look at the worst conflict of all, Syria, which I believe the United States was not really responsible for. That was a civil war in which 613,000 people are dead, and the death toll continues. I could go on, but I think you in this audience, both in the webosphere and here in this room, I'm glad to see you coming out, by the way, those of you who can, understand that what I'm saying is my region, the Middle East, is actually worse off today than it was when I started covering it, and I had great hopes for it in 1972. The other country that I've been involved with most immediately is Ukraine. I was there last year. I have visited every year for the past 10 years, and I was even there when it was part of the great Soviet Union, not so great, which is responsible for the slaughter rather than the United States in Ukraine. If you have not seen 20 Days in Mariupol, I urge all of you to do so. You can do so online. It is 1 hour of the most horrific slaughter I have seen and have covered personally in my lifetime. And that is also not the United States. But the point I want to make is that the reason I'm pessimistic is that we don't seem to have mechanisms, be they global or national, for dealing with these crises that are effective. And the ones we do have, such as the UN, are weaker today than they've ever been before. And even the countries that band together under defense coalitions like NATO, which is now expanding thanks to Russia's aggression in Ukraine, do not seem to, they can defend so far against Russian aggression and territorial ambition, but they can't seem to come up with solutions for making the world a better or more peaceful place. I'm pessimistic because a woman that I have known and covered all my life in the Middle East on October 7th, an Israeli who worked for peace every day, whom I stood with on the White House lawn during the Oslo Accords when there was hope for the Middle East, American-generated also, has worked dutifully, went to Gaza all of the time, took people who were sick from Gaza to Israeli hospitals. I talked to her after October 7th, and I said, I'm sure you've heard from all of the Arab friends whom you've helped and worked with and written about. And she said, no, actually, you are my first call. I think there's a certain lack of empathy. We all get almost overwhelmed with the violence and the slaughter. And while I continue to believe that if reporters go out into the field and risk our own lives covering these conflicts so that the world knows what goes on, the world responds with a large collective shrug. And that's more depressing than anything else. If anything, the world is a much more violent place than the world that I hoped to change through journalism. But the one thing I do know is that because I can't think of anything else that's better to do, I'm going to continue trying to do it and visit these places, covering the oppressed, covering people who may not be in war, but live in a kind of cold repression, and that's most of the Middle East. As for the United States and our faults, yes, we have many. We've made many mistakes. I was a vehement opponent of the war in Vietnam. I know those mistakes very well. But I will just end with this thought. The world will not be a better place when China runs it. And if you don't believe that, just ask the Uyghurs, if you can find them outside of the 1 million who are now in virtual concentration camps. So sorry about the pessimism, but perhaps it's a professional flaw as well as a personal one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would hope that we have an opportunity to challenge some of these assertions.
Of course. As I'm sure other speakers will challenge you.
I expect that too.
Yeah. Next is Pierre Buller, who has a degree from half of all France's big schools, the latest being ENA. He's been a diplomat and he's run the Institut Français till 2020. He is the author of La puissance au XXIe siècle, Nouvelle définition du monde, that is power in the 21st century, new definitions of the world. What are these new definitions? And by the way, can diplomacy really do much at a time when power is shifting, as Mr. Vaslekar alluded to, Raymond Aron and Clausewitz as well? If power is shifting, is drifting and shifting, can you really settle into a structure without some violence? In that sense, I mean, I want to invite you back to the title of the conversation, that is, is war avoidable?
Thank you, Soli, and good evening, everyone. I have a double challenge tonight, which is to provide an answer to that question, but also to shoehorn it into a 6-minute.
Oh no, I've been negligent of my duties. I've given everyone 7.5. So.
Okay, a few days ago there was a debate here in this very room with another question: is war the new normal? Which is sort of a negative of the positive side of the question of today, and. Actually, we ended up with, answers contingent upon the speaker and the conclusion that eventually it lies in the eye of the beholder. So my take on that issue, I would like to invite you to a very quick look into the past of war, not the 20 to 50 years, but as Sandeep referred to 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. That was war was a normal between polities, whether tribes, whether empires, whether kingdoms or nation states. And Charles Tilly, sociologist, an American sociologist and historian, devoted research to 1,000 years of European history. And he had a very elegant conclusion to sum it up. He said, war made the state, and the state made war. I think this is a good definition of Europe. And so the normal wars also territory, slaves, treasures, the bounty. The normal was submission of the vanquished into subservience or subjugation or colonization, vassalage at best. And when the adversary was too hard not to crack, it ended with a treaty tagged of perpetual peace until just the following war. But the question we have to answer is not the new normal, but what the ways are have been pioneered to avoid war. And so there were many such attempts in the wake of the Renaissance, humanism, on how to rein in war and war violence. There was the shock of World War I with 18 million casualties, which happened among Europeans. This was not a colonial war, it was a European war which prompted President Wilson to attempt an organization on peace based on law and democracy, enshrined in the Covenant of League of Nations, with mottos such as make the world safe for democracy, or this famous 99% insurance against war. As we know, the whole thing unraveled and brought us to straight to World War II, and renewed thinking about how to best organize the world after the war. And this is how the victors, mainly the United States, came up with a more robust model than the League of Nations, namely clear rules enshrined in a universal treaty, the UN Charter, and a political body, Security Council, to enforce compliance by all signatories. But as we know, it jammed quickly with the beginning of the Cold War, Korean War, and also, and I think I found some resonance in some of our other panelists' interventions, blatant breaches by those very victorious powers supposed to be the guardians and the stewards of that order. I do not shy away from mentioning France and the UK intervening in Egypt, against Egypt with the Suez Canal issue. Soviet Union in Budapest, the same year, by the way, Budapest, then Prague, and then Afghanistan, the US in, waging a war in Vietnam, and then in Iraq, Russia invading parts of Georgia, and then of Ukraine. There was only one instance when this system functioned. It was 1990, and it was the United States. President Bush, after the invasion or annexation of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein, who called for a new world order where the rule of law supplants the law of the jungle, and where the strong respects the right of the weak. And well, he played by the rules, and the coalition withdrew from Iraq. And this is, I think, the first, to my knowledge at least, the first time and the last time it occurred. But when those powers were breaching the rules, they were always keen to provide an alibi, a hollow one, but illustrating Lao Tzu's maxim that hypocrisy is a tribute, vice pays to virtue, and the alibi Putin, you found, was sheer lunacy to invade Ukraine in 2022, claiming to carry out denazification of a country, Ukraine, whose right to exist as a nation he had plainly denied. But there are other ways than just UN or UN procedures to avoid war. For half a century, I should like to remind that, to emphasize it, for half a century, another lunacy prevailed, within a large part of mankind on the assumption that war is a consequence of imperialism. And imperialism, as Lenin taught us, is the highest stage of capitalism. And, well, at the end of the day, victory of socialism and demise of capitalism, the issue would be solved for good. As we know, history took the opposite direction, breathing life into another theory, the end of history theory, more promising because it was based on on the craving of people for freedom, for democracy, for justice and the rule of law, which brought us closer to the possibility of war, of peace through democracy.
End of history didn't really work, but end of talk is.
Okay, so I will conclude. Skip to my conclusion. Well, to answer the question, Russia's onslaught on Ukraine was the final nail in the coffin of collective security. Peace through law, concept that's an illusion we can only mourn now. Security guarantees are hardly an option, as European history is littered with hollowed and hence failed guarantees. Therefore, in my view at least, the prospect of a new European security architecture seems a plain pipe dream. And that does not mean that I favor that option, but the best available and most reliable guarantee will remain what it has been throughout history: strength and power to deter aggression. How? By piling up military might by states. For the weaker states, it will be seeking protection of a more powerful one through alliances, bilateral or multilateral. For some, when they can afford it, it will be the acquisition of a nuclear deterrent, which points towards the end, or at least the decay of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is already partly weakened, and brings us back to the model of the Cold War, which was an era of tensions, an era of costly military expenditure, but which also secured 45 years of peace for those countries which benefited from it and allowed them to thrive in prosperity. Is it the only way? Well, there's another path, I think, but I will leave it for
the second round.
Conclusive remarks.
Now, last but not least, definitely not. The only reason he is the last because he's the youngest member of the panel. He's Gilles Yaby, and he's the founder of WATHI, the West African Citizen Think Tank, that he founded in 2015. He has a PhD from Clermont-Ferrand in France, and his experience as a journalist for Jeune Afrique. And I promise I will listen to you. Which day do you speak on the radio?
On Saturday.
Yeah, every Saturday he does have a 4-minute reflection on the beauty of the world and the nice things that happen around the world, I suppose, or in West Africa mostly. Can I also ask you just to add, I'm not very comfortable with this thing, Global South. I don't like labels personally. In my youth, it used to be the Third World. Do you think there is really much that the Global South can do except for raising its voice, though the institutions really allow it to have much of an impact on what goes on? Can what Mr. Waslekar wish actually be realized?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here at the Maison Française. So thank you for hosting us. Thanks to Région Normandie as well for organizing this series of discussions. I think it's actually quite a vivid conversation, and I think it's not so bad to have both online and on-site panelists, but I think it's already a success to have different perspective on what is going on in the world. And I think it's extremely important when doing that to make sure that we take into account the reality of the demography of the world. And yes, maybe on the issue of global south, I don't know. I'm actually quite sure that it's quite obvious that all the countries that are supposed to be in the global south don't share the same interest and are even competitors on some fronts. But the reality is that they are collectively asking for just a recognition of the history and a recognition also of the reality in terms of the proportion of the world that they constitute. When you take Asia and you take Africa, and when you include not the reality of the demography today, but when you include the projections in terms of world population from now to 2050 and 2100, and then you will see, of course, a very significant change into world population. During my flight from Dakar yesterday, I watched one of these several US movies on heroic operation of special forces based on true stories. The one that I watched was based on an operation in Afghanistan. There were a few others that I watched quite recently, which were based on true stories from Libya. And I think the US cinema industry has this capacity and talent to celebrate the courage and dedication of several thousands of soldiers who are always ready to pay the price, the ultimate price for the defense of a country, based on the decision of the political leaders. There is something fascinating about war, about heroism, about violence, about sophisticated weapons. But we know that it is very different from when you watch these kind of movies. It's very different from how people who actually live in the places where you have these military operations, where they live, the kind of feeling that they have about war. So it's not fiction. And I think that we probably have never seen so many images of war on a daily basis on TV everywhere than in the last 2 years, with the war in Ukraine, and for several months now, the war in Gaza and around Gaza. As you know, there are possibility of military operations extending to other places, including Rafah. Those images are real, and while we speak tonight, it is likely that the war is going on in Gaza, that people, including children, will be killed in explosions which don't discriminate between targeted combatants and families. The figures might be those of Hamas, but I think there is no doubt about the fact that we have several children being killed. When watching those movies about Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, I think what we don't see, of course, is the huge mid and long-term cost of those wars for the countries and the millions of people who live in those countries. When I take the example of Libya, I'm based in Senegal, working in West Africa and Sahel situation, and the 10-year destabilization of the Sahel from Mali to Burkina Faso to Niger, and now actually coastal countries of Benin, Cote d'Ivoire are also exposed. Of course, you have a lot of factors, internal factors. It is very clear you cannot attribute everything to external factors, but it's also a reality that the destabilization of Libya and the NATO intervention in Libya has a very important consequences for the entire region in terms of proliferation of weapons and collapse of Libya. And Libya would probably take maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades, maybe 3 decades, maybe 40 years to recover, if it recovers actually. And the reality is that the consequences, again, are long-term consequences, not only for Libya, but for many countries around. When you look at the continent today, there is the demography. Where there was an article by New York Times just a few months ago saying that the world is becoming more African, stating that with the demography of the continent, Africa will definitely play a stronger role in the international scene, including growing in terms of its economy. But my main concern is that political insecurity, reality now, and what we can see in the last 10, 20 years, is the main actually obstacle to any significant improvement in the life of people in the continent. You just take the three big countries of the continent, Sudan, at first, a very horrendous war going on there, and not so much attention, of course, when you compare with Ukraine and Gaza. There was a report just published 2 days ago by the UN Human Rights Office describing the extent of war crimes in Sudan. Sudan used to be the largest country in the continent. Since independence, it's because you have South Sudan now, but Sudan remained the third largest country in the continent. Ethiopia is the second most populated country in the continent. You also have a very devastating war in Ethiopia. Crimes against humanity were committed, and the situation has not been fully resolved. And then you take, of course, Democratic Republic of Congo. Has been at war basically since independence, and despite decades of presence of a UN mission in the country, you still have...
I'm glad you mentioned, because I just checked, 5.4 million people died since 1998.
Yes, it is huge, and it is continuing in the eastern part of the country right now, and we are quite close to a war between DRC and Rwanda, because Rwanda is supporting one of the armed groups attacking DRC. And we also know that DRC has basically everything: gold, diamonds, coltan, cobalt, which is going to play a very important role in the energetic transition. DRC has half of the reserve in the world. So this is just to say that you always have also an economic dimension in, when you analyze the conflict and war. Let's not forget the economic dimension. Let's not forget the link between geopolitical interest and economic interest of powerful countries. So a few words just to conclude. First, I think the ethical conduct by powerful nations and those who defend democracy and human rights as their core values matters. Validating, endorsing blatant violation of human rights gave a signal to all other actors in the world that violence is legitimate, not just in self-defense, but also in retaliation and vengeance. We are generating an unprecedented level of anger and desire for violence and retaliation, and the consequences are not going to be localized. And also, I think sentence. That's the very last one. One is just to state that what was said about the military complex is extremely important in my opinion, and it is important also to look at how internal politics, and not only in powerful nations, but everywhere now, is part of the problem, nurturing the kind of foreign policies that actually lead to war and violence. So working on politics, how it is done, and working on consolidating democracy, not just with election, but by putting more emphasis on citizen education and on the reality of the foreign policies of democratic countries, I think is extremely important. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It's 7:36. I'm supposed to close this at 8. Obviously, there will have to be a second round of at least 1.5 minutes each. And then I also have things to say. How can I not say? But I just want to say one thing. The question of our panel was, is war avoidable? I think except for our first speaker, we avoided the question. Because I would have expected, rather than questioning Hamas's figures or West bashing or whatever, we would have asked a deeper question. Whether we like it or not, whether it is something to celebrate or to regret, power is shifting. Politics is about power. War is about power. And the question that we're facing today is, will a new world order that will bring peace and stability be created out of the instability or destabilizing dynamics of a world where power economically and politically is shifting? Because I will get back to you, just a second. Because historically, even before the West was invented, there was violence. And there is really no guarantee that if the West were to disappear tomorrow, there will not be violence. So this thing, I mean, it is true that capitalism generates certain interests that are then driving forces for wars. But does it really explain all of that? I'm not really quite sure. So if I will give you the first word, but if you would really reflect on the topic rather than apportion blame, because I think we've heard it, it will be much more useful for the audience and actually for the messages of this panel. You do have a minute and a half because we have to give the audience at least 10 to 12 minutes to actually ask questions. Mr. Nair.
Thank you. I thought I did emphasize that the way to can we avoid wars, but I dare say that the question itself is rather naive. That should not be the question. The question really should be, what are the root causes of the existential threats of war that we look at? To ask the question, can we avoid wars? We need to look at what the root causes. And I suggested that one of the ways to do this is to essentially understand what are the triggers for that war this way. And I did accept that Mr. Sandeep had put forward those things, and I was not going to repeat it. Did I also say that to suggest and point in an open forum like this, that there are actors that have proven time again to be essentially the initiators of war, and the current discussion, particularly in the West, to create enemies, is not Western bashing. That too is, I think, a disservice to an intellectual discourse about this. And I don't think that, and this is why it's so difficult to have a decent conversation, intellectually robust conversation about the true costs. You can't deny the fact that the military-industrial complex in America is one of the biggest threats to world peace, and to suggest that the events in Gaza cannot be stopped if the military-industrial complex didn't exist and funding was not given, and to then just argue simplistically that October 7th was the start is very disingenuous. And that is really what I was trying to say. We have these disingenuous conversations, then we can't even have a discussion about whether wars can be stopped or not. And I dare humbly say that was not the question that I would have framed it as, but I did suggest that Mr. Sandeep had put together some ideas. But my question was, are we bold enough to essentially assert and blame where it is due? And that is not to essentially bash anyone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Judith Miller, what does it matter? What does it matter if there are 28,000 dead or 14,000 dead? Isn't it fair to ask when the world, it's going to be nearly 5 months now, that we watch live relentless bombardment, which I would say brave Israelis and brave Israeli journalists are exposing. And the US, which I suppose has some leeway, for one reason or another, does not do in public what presumably it does, or the president does in private. How to explain that? And how to square this with the moralistic discourse that is so prevalent about Ukraine?
Excellent questions, Soli. And let me say, first of all, I'm not justifying the Israeli response by saying, by quibbling about the number of people dead. What I'm saying is we have to be careful about a lot of assertions coming out of both sides, but especially the Hamas side, because partly Israel's fault. There is no way to verify or get an independent assessment, either from the UN, which doesn't have complete mobility now and the ability to do a death count, a casualty count. A grain of skepticism about numbers is in order, but two, of course, what's going on there is horrible. I would also suggest, as somebody who's covered the Middle East a long time, that it was entirely predictable that this would be the response because these are the rules of the Middle East. It's never been an eye for an eye. It's 10 eyes for an eye. And Israeli deterrence, whether or not it's correct, and I'm not defending it, I'm trying to explain it, rests on the assumption that if the casualties are high enough, what happened on October 7th will not happen again. Now that may be a faulty assumption on Israel's part. But so far, that is the assumption of the Israeli government. Now, what is America's role? I think that the Biden administration is correct in asserting that what it says to Israel in private is more powerful than what it's saying publicly. That actually, if it says what it's saying in private publicly, it would be counterproductive. I don't think it helps at this point to join the global attack on Israel. It makes them more defensive. It makes them more determined to carry out what they're planning in Rafah. One last sentence. Why am I so pessimistic? I'm pessimistic because human beings are the only animals that kill for sport. And they will go on killing. In war, in civil war, in aggression state to state, the goal should be to prevent the use of the worst weapons that can destroy all of us, rather than think that we can eliminate war, because we won't.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, your task is to avoid war. And obviously your profession has been rather unsuccessful in getting there. Why? And okay, since you mentioned Lenin, let me go on with it as well. What is to be done?
Well, I would beg to disagree with you.
Okay.
No, statesmen and diplomats have managed to create an environment where peace, I don't know whether it's perpetual, but where peace can reign. And this is Europe. Europe was the most war-torn region of the world for at least 2 millenniaries. And, some wise men decided in the early 1950s that, we have to stop that. And they pooled together the 2 ingredients of war, which are coal and steel. And this was the beginning of the European project. It was the start of the European project. And all 6 countries, but then it extended. And all those countries which had conflicts among them, border conflicts, linguistic, whatever, they agreed to pool those, to get over their historic conflicts and to work together on one basis, which is the rule of law, by treaty of the European Union, but also the European Human Rights Convention. And everybody has to stick to that. Otherwise, they are in trouble. Some try to escape that. But Europe is it's sort of almost, I would say, a blessed region, but not blessed by God. It's blessed by themselves because they managed to go beyond their historic conflicts and opposition. So I think if we could extend that, this was a utopia at the moment, to extend it to the rest of the world. Of course, it still remains a utopia, but that utopia works in our part of the world.
Okay. Mr. Waslekar, you have been patiently listening to what we have been saying, and I think Mr. Ambassador just sent you a good pass for you to score. because he said, can we expand what the Europeans accomplished, and what the Europeans accomplished is now also open to debate by Europeans themselves, but still what he is touching on something that's real that we can see. What do you suggest needs to be done? You've already suggested that you need to have a peace movement, which we don't. Kind of we do, but we don't. And then you also suggested, and this is what I asked our last speaker as well, that the global south would have to put pressure. In some sense, that is being done. That's what South Africa has done. This is what Brazil is trying to do. India is in between. But what do you suggest beyond what you have already told us in 2 minutes?
Well, the biggest problem right now is that we have a nationalist approach to international affairs. And this was okay until 1945, before the nuclear weapon was detonated. But now, when the survival of the entire human civilization is at stake because some war might slide into a global nuclear war, we need a civilizational approach to addressing the global problems. And therefore, what we need is to recognize the limitations and incompetence of the UN Security Council, which just tries to respond to crises in the regions and doesn't care for the conflicts which involve the big powers, whether the US or the Russia or even China. What we need is a civilizational crisis response mechanism. And we need to create a global pressure by intellectuals, by diplomats who have some sense in them, and create a civilizational crisis response mechanism to try to prevent all civilizational crises. And the biggest civilizational crisis is the risk of war. And for that, I would again go back to Raymond Aron's maxim that while diplomats consider defending national interests as their goal, preventing a global hyperbolic war is also an equally important goal for all the diplomats of the world. And that has to be made a priority. The UN is really a united governments organization. It represents the vested interests of the governments. We need to convert the UN into a United Nations organization, which would represent the interests and aspirations of the people. One last point. We need to reflect on the missed opportunities and see how we can correct the situation. In 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed in Reykjavik to abolish or eliminate all weapons of mass destruction in a period of 10 years, in a phased manner. Who undermined that agreement? Who put pressure on the President of the United States to not to go ahead with this agreement? And who put pressure on the head of the Soviet Union not to go ahead with this agreement? On 20th December 1961, Khrushchev and Kennedy managed to get consensus from the entire General Assembly on the principles of general and complete disarmament. Who undermined the desire of the President of the United States at that time? So even if you have presidents of the biggest powers wanting to negotiate peace and wanting to create an environment where you can avoid war and you can eliminate the military industrial complex and other kind of motivations for war, somebody comes and pressurizes even the presidents of the United States. So we need an open debate. There is no open debate on who undermined UNGA 1722. No open debate on who undermined Reagan-Gorbachev agreement. No open debate on when Russia intervened Ukraine in 2014, not in 2022. it violated an agreement which was reached by US, Russia, UK, France, and China jointly with Ukraine.
When you're running out of time.
Yeah. So how did that agreement got violated, and why there was no response except for some sanctions? Why there was no diplomatic response? So we need to revisit why we made these mistakes and how we not make these mistakes in future.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Yabi, you have the last word for the panel. Since we started 5 minutes late, we'll leave at 7:05. Again, after you've listened to everyone, when you reflect upon everything you've heard, what would you say about avoiding war? I mean, after all, Africa is going to be the only continent where the population is going to increase. Everywhere else, it's going to decrease, or it's going to get very old. Again, it has a lot of minerals that the so-called green transformation would put its eyes on and destroy your environment. What do you see coming out of Africa? Because that is where most attention is going to be turned. This is about a chunk of the global south. As I said, I don't like the term, but for lack of a better one. How do you reflect on it? How do you deal with the conflicts in Africa, which claim so many lives every day, every hour, and don't get the attention they deserve? I remember Boutros Ghali, who said, 800,000 people died in Rwanda in 3 months. Nobody really paid much attention, and Bosnia, of course, because it was in Europe, got everybody's attention, and then he got grilled for it, but I think ultimately he was not wrong.
Yeah, well.
And again, all of this under 2 minutes.
Of course, I know. No, I think if we take what has been happening in Democratic Republic of Congo, as I said before, and we look at how the mineral of this country have been contributing to, in the mobile phone, in the computers that we all use everywhere, you have elements of those natural resources. And I think let's not forget that everything that is around us is made of natural resources, which is transformed. And when I look at the poverty in DRC, the conflict, the violence, the rape, the war crimes that were committed, of course, if I consider that these countries still have the most significant resources that are important for developed economies and developing economies as well, I'm not really optimistic about what it means for the future of DRC, and of course that can be extended to other part of the continent, especially when we know that we are talking about countries where we still have very weak state, weak political institution. We still need to work on our own structural challenges, education, health. So it will be extremely difficult in this context to be able, again, to resist the consequences of rivalries for the mineral resources of the continent. And I think, going back to the question, can war be avoided? I was wondering whether we should not ask the question whether it is fair that it's kind of the same places in the world that have most important concentration of violence and conflicts. And so I think it would be fair that I think Africa has paid a huge cost in the last century and a half of colonization and everything. And I think what people expect in the continent is that we don't pay again these huge costs and without even having the benefits of being producer of weapons. I think Turkey is selling a lot of drones now, and drones are very popular in West Africa and the Sahel. At least if we produce our weapons, we would have some economic benefits from having war, but we don't even produce the imports. We are nurturing the global industry, and we are actually paying the cost of these additional violence. So I think this kind of debate is extremely important in educating, I think, everyone about the need for conversation from all the continents on all those issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Audience, you cannot complain you cannot complain that we have not delivered you a miserable picture. So we have 7 minutes, and then I'll take 3 questions, and please make sure whom you address the question to, please. And short, please.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Alan Seckler. I'm a retiree from the United Nations, and I spent time in Congo, Democratic Republic of, as a political affairs officer. What struck me there and in other parts was a level of corruption, of massive state corruption, triggered both by national actors and also international actors, both from democratic and from autocratic major states. And I would like to see if there is, I think it's one of the major issues in the future, already now. What can be done to address this question? Thank you.
Anybody else?
Hello, my name is Beatrix. I'm a current graduate student at NYU. I have a question for Madame Miller. Given your experience as a journalist, you mentioned the large disconnect between the content that audiences are consuming and their reaction. You mentioned that people tend to respond to atrocities with a shrug, and I'm wondering if you have any insights into why that is, because it seems to me that that could very well be a way we could avoid war.
That's it. Okay. On corruption, I'll give word to everyone. You go ahead, you answer.
I'll answer the Beatrix. I wish I had an answer to that. I don't. I think for those of us who've seen just a lot of violence and a lot of killing, even we, after a while, develop, you almost have to develop a thick skin in order to continue doing it. The danger is developing that thick skin lessens your empathy. I don't know what one can do, but I do know this. There's less news about places like Rwanda, about Africa, violence where we don't see it, because journalists, mostly in America, can't get to these places because the organizations they work for won't support it anymore. I remember once proposing to Fox News when I worked there, I no longer do, we need to do a foreign affairs show. And I was told, foreign affairs is a ratings loser. Foreign bureaus are expensive. Going to these places is expensive. It costs $1 million to field a foreign correspondent today. Most news organizations, which are dying, cannot afford to do this. So Americans know less about these conflicts than we ever knew before.
Does anybody want to pick up on the corruption question? Yeah, please go ahead.
I would just say I come from a small country, and I totally agree with the comment made, and it's directly linked to the fact that the military-industrial complex, though the largest part is centered in the U.S., followed by Europe, is essentially a corrupt international network. It corrupts generals in Pakistan, right through Southeast Asia. They buy them out. So it's a very, very insidious thing. And the only way we can do it, at least what I try and do in my country, is to try and say and expose the military establishment and its links to the military-industrial complex. But the global military-industrial complex is a lot more powerful than we think. And dare I say, its partners in this include many parts of the media who foster fear, conflict, and therein lies corruption. So yes, that's a very true statement. But we have to expose it in our own countries as well. But understand, it's an international network. It's a very dangerous and powerful system that operates throughout the world.
Mr. Westlaker, do you want to chip in?
I didn't get the essence of the question because of the big line.
It was about how corruption corrodes things, and then whether or not anything could be done about it. And the person who raised the question is a retired UN official.
And how corrupt is the UN?
No. No. Is corruption one of the reasons we end up with war? Is basically in the context of our panel. Well, anyway, you don't have to say anything. I just wondered.
Corruption is definitely one of the reasons, but there are other reasons also. I think one reason which we haven't really looked at today, and we haven't mentioned, is that the politicians, I mean, that this is more a moral corruption than just the financial corruption. They always find an instrument for mobilizing public opinion in favor of war. And currently, the favorite instrument is nationalism. Everybody is promoting nationalism to create vested interest in war. Earlier, that favorite instrument was religion. And so religion was used for centuries, and passions were evoked to mobilize public opinion in favor of war.
Okay.
So basically, when we talk about corruption, it's not just the financial corruption that others have referred to. That's very much there, and creation of vested interest. But the most serious is the moral corruption, and the spread of hyper-nationalism is the biggest example of how moral corruption is spreading fast. And the results, the likely results of the elections in the course of 2022, we talk about the expression of democracy, but we might see the emergence of hyper-nationalist forces in many different parts of the world, including the European Parliament, which goes to the election in June, and we will have this problem accentuated.
Yes, Mr. Ambassador.
My own take on corruption is that the best antidote for corruption is transparency and disclosure. And this can only happen in an environment where the freedom of the press is secured. And I truly believe that we're in a world where most freedoms are shrinking, including the freedom of the press, where journalists are killed or jailed. We are living in a world, I don't want to drop names, but a world of kleptocrats, dictators, satraps, and other despots who keep their constituency under the thumb of their rule and take this opportunity to enrich themselves, prosecuting anything that can go against that aim. And definitely journalists are the first victims of those practices in many, many countries of the world.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
As a journalist, you can conclude the session.
No, actually, no, I think you are totally right in the fact that corruption is probably, in my opinion, one of the most important issues in the continent in Africa. But of course, it's a problem everywhere. Actually, when we started WATI a few years ago, the very first topic of what we call the debates of WATI was about the title, How to Fight Corruption, because I really think that it is just impossible to have the kind of progress that we want on the continent if we don't reduce the level of corruption. And I insist on reduction. And I think we need a very cold economic approach, which is not to say that we'll eliminate corruption. When I hear that from political actors, it's clearly a very bad sign, because we are not serious about eliminating corruption. But I think we can be serious about reducing the extent of corruption and the worst forms of corruption that exist. At the same time, I think when you analyze corruption and you have economic analysis of corruption, you quickly see that you have to work on political institutions, because you have corruption which is embedded in how our democratic election work, and not only in Africa, but actually everywhere. With what you need to fund elections, definitely you will see a link with corruption, and you need to work on education. My opinion is that we really need to work on a culture of integrity, but that's the long-term battle. But I think that we also need to work on international finance, as that was mentioned, because there is an international dimension of corruption that allows people to get illicit funds to exceed the countries. So,
when the next round of such discussions are organized, one of that may very well be on how authoritarian regimes actually reproduce themselves. And I think we fool ourselves thinking that authoritarian regimes reproduce themselves only through violence, because populations are also corrupt. They are bought off. It's much better to be a careerist than an idealist bureaucrat. It is much better to lay low than risk being put in jail. So I think part of the problem you have in the world is how that kind of corruption that pervades society, because everybody gets something from the distributors, is insidious, and it really corrodes the body politic. But that was not our topic. This is my suggestion for the next round. Pierre Buchner, Shadred Nair, Sandrine Westerhaar, Gilles Yadvi, and Judith Miller, thank you very much. I think this was depressing enough. We've actually managed to give our good message. Thank you very much for coming.